So now that we've covered some of the analyses that we can do in a vector setting, let's talk about the kinds of things that we can do in a raster setting, because in raster type data, because it's so data dense, because there's so much detail there, it also means that we can do a lot more in terms of analysis. And so let's start by talking about a very common type of raster data set, which is the digital elevation model. And again, a digital elevation model is a raster data set representing elevation at each grid cell, meaning we have a whole bunch of grid cells. This is the east part of Maui, for example. Each grid cell is 10 meters by 10 meters, which means for every 10 meter by 10 meter square in this entire area, we have basically an estimate of the elevation at that location, right? And when we look at this, we can see the colors are showing us from the lowest elevations in white through all of this rainbow of colors to the highest elevations in red. And you can see there's a lot of detail there. But it turns out there are some analyses we can do that are specific to digital elevation models to give us even more information about this area, right? So this is East Maui. Again, this is a very mountainous area, but this is where we have Haleakala Crater and some other features, and some valleys and all of this sort of thing. We can't entirely see that or visualize that here, but there are some things that we can do to understand that landscape a little bit better by analyzing this digital elevation model. The first thing we can do is we can calculate the slope. So we can look at those individual grid cells, look at the neighboring grid cells and say, is this an area that is really steep or is this an area that's relatively flat? And so by doing that analysis from the digital elevation model, you can see that we have these areas of Maui that are relatively flat. So this is kind of that central valley of Maui with Kahului up here. And these areas are pretty flat if anybody's been there. But then you go up the slope to Haleakala Crater, things are starting to get really steep. And then you can see we have this really steep area, which is basically a cliff that's making the border of Haleakala Crater. And then we have another area that's relatively flat down in the bottom of Haleakala Crater. So again, this is one way that we can sort of assess which areas are relatively flat and which areas are relatively steep. And again, this has been produced from the digital elevation model, or the DEM, from this special analysis. Another thing we can do is we can say not only how steep is the slope, but we can say which way is the slope facing? Is this slope facing to the north, to the east, to the south, to the west? And so what this is showing us is basically a series of colors where anything facing to the north is given a red color, anything facing to the south is given a green color, right? And we have this whole range of colors giving us the different directions that things are sloping. Again, that gives us some situations. We may have situations where, example, for exposure to sunlight or getting a sense of whether there's morning sun or evening sun. These are interesting things to want to know if you're putting in, for example, a solar power facility, right? Where are we going to get the best facing direction toward the most intense sunlight? So that's something that we might do with something looking at this. And by the way, this is referred to as aspect. Aspect is just the direction that a slope is facing. It's independent of the steepness. It's independent of the slope. So we could have a steep slope that's facing north. We could have a gentle slope that's facing north. But either way, these are going to have the same aspect because it's facing to the north. Another thing we can do is to have what we call a hillshade, or what's called shaded relief. And really, this is combining both the slope and the aspect to create a visualization of what that landscape looks like in 3 dimensions. And what it's doing is it's thinking about if we had a light source somewhere. And so in this case, the light source is to the northwest, right? So you can imagine the sun is somewhere over here shining, and anything that is a slope that's facing to the northwest is going to get illuminated, and anything that is facing away is going to be a darker color. And meaning it's being sort of shadowed, or it's in the shade, right? And furthermore, it also has a little bit of a hint of the steepness. The more steeply and directly it's facing into the sun, the lighter the color is going to be. The more steeply it's facing away from the sun, the darker the color is going to be. And so you can see this is derived from that same digital elevation model. This hillshade or shaded relief has a lot of detail, and that detail allows us to visualize the landscape in a way that's just not possible looking at contour lines or just at raw elevation values. Now, the final thing we can do in a raster environment, and this is a little bit complicated, is what we call map calculation. And what map calculation does is it takes a series of different layers, and each one of those layers, and these are represented by different colors here, have their own separate grid of values, right? And so we can do things with those values by comparing those layers or interacting those layers. So in the first example here, this is water level. Let's say this is the water level of water for the groundwater depth, let's say. And let's say during a drought period, the water depth is a little bit deeper. You have to drill a little deeper for the water. During periods of time when there's more water available, it might be a little more shallow, and so these numbers are smaller, right? And so we can compare those three, and we can say, well, which of those is the lowest value? In other words, if I'm drilling a well, I want to say, well, what is the minimum depth I need to drill to get water anytime, right? Or I might say, well, what is the maximum depth? You know, how deep do I need to drill the well so that I know I'm going to get water even in a drought year, right? We can calculate the average, we can calculate the standard deviation, because basically at a given location, you have a series of numbers that you can then examine, look for the high values, the low values, the mean values. Another thing we could do is, and let's say we have some kind of a raster that's representing a ranking based on something, right? So we might have areas that are basically saying, well, what is the slope in this area? If it's a steep slope, I'm going to give it a low value because I don't really like that. If it's a gentle slope, a flatter area, I'm going to give it a high value because I like that, right? So that's basically a way of assigning some kind of value to something. And in that case, we could do that with soil texture. So the areas with a favorable soil texture would get a high value. The aspect, we want areas that are facing into the sun, let's say. We don't want areas facing away from the sun. And so we might give them a high value. But basically, we can take these three ways of valuing the landscape, and these are totally different things. These are different criteria, and we can add them together, right? And so at one location, we can add its ranking from this criteria, this criteria, this criteria, to give us a total number. By adding those together, we can then get a total number and say, considering all of these things together, where are the areas that I would rank the highest, that have the best conditions for some kind of agriculture, right? So again, this is solving a problem. This is allowing us to identify the best areas for some kind of activity. I'll just give another example here from my own research. And one of the things that we did was we used maps of different types of forest. We used a digital elevation model considering elevation and other things to determine what is the habitat for different species of birds. And so this is a habitat map, for example, for apapane. All these areas in green we believe are suitable habitat for apapane. Akiapola'au is a rarer bird that only lives in higher elevation because it's very susceptible to diseases spread by mosquitoes at low elevations. And we basically have these maps for a whole bunch of different bird species, more than a dozen bird species on this island that we assessed. And we made an individual map for each one of those. And so what we did was we did a calculation where we assigned a value of 1 to the habitat of each individual bird species, and then added those layers together, right? And so we added this one, and then a whole bunch of other ones, basically to determine at any given location, any given grid cell, what are the number of bird species that occur at that location. And this produced what we call a bird species richness map. In other words, you can see these areas in dark blue. These are the areas that have 9 or 10 bird species at those locations. And this was an important thing that we needed to do, basically to address problems of conservation. Where do we put our resources in terms of setting land aside and doing things to protect and promote these bird species? And we identified those areas, again, by overlapping all of these different layers and essentially adding them up. And so this was basically a calculation. We added up all of the 1 values that were associated with the habitat for those individual bird species to give us a map of the richness of all the different parts of the landscape. And so you can see we have these areas that have very high richness values. You can see the very highest elevations of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, which are kind of an alpine desert environment, have very few species. Actually, there are no forest bird species up there. Lava flow areas also are going to tend to have few species. So again, this is just one way that we can pull large amounts of data together to come up with some kind of a product that has some kind of use. So that's in a nutshell the major types of analyses that we're going to cover in this class. We will try some of them out in exercises, so you'll get a hands-on chance to try some of these out, but we'll also have some tutorials to kind of walk you through this.